Okay, so I am back, and we are going to finish up talking about the Canterbury Tales. And like I said, this is essentially a long list of people and a long list of pilgrims going to Canterbury. So I'm not going to bore you with every single person on the pilgrimage. I wouldn't do that to you guys. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. But what I am going to ask you to do is two things. One, as we're going through all of the characters, all of the pilgrims, I want to see if you can, keep a list mentally, write it down. Which of the three classes or estates each of them falls into? Do they fall into the aristocracy, who spoke French? Do they fall into the clergy, who spoke Latin? Or do they fall into the everybody else category, who spoke the vernacular or Middle English? And remember, Canterbury Tales is the first work that was written for everybody, that was written in the vernacular. That's one thing I want you guys to keep in mind. The other thing I want you guys to try to figure out or keep in mind is which of the three estates or classes comes off looking the worst. Which one do you think Chaucer hits the hardest with his satire? Is it the aristocracy? Is it the clergy? Or is it the everybody else? So keep those things in mind as we start moving through the Canterbury Tales. And we are going to start off with the knight, who is the knightliest knight who ever did knight in the history of knightdom. We're going to find problems with pretty much every one of the pilgrims we talk about. Hard to find something wrong with the knight. He is the best knight in the history of knightdom. He comes straight from battle with his armor on. He's won a ton of honor and glory on the battlefield, but he's not arrogant or proud about it. He's really humble. He is as chivalrous as a knight comes. He is friendly and courteous and pious, and he is like the best knight you could possibly imagine. The epitome, the embodiment of knighthood. His son, on the other hand, who is a squire, who is basically a knight in training, in a lot of ways, he's the opposite of his dad. Where his dad's dressed in armor, he's dressed in long, silk, flowing clothes. Told you Chaucer kind of gets obsessed with clothes because his dad was a clothes maker. His dad's carrying a sword and shield. The kid is carrying a lute or a musical instrument, lute or a flute, depending on your translation. The dad's seen battle. This kid has never seen a day of battle in his life. And this kid is in love, and he's basically in the night he's basically becoming a knight for the girls. I'm going to be honest with you. He's in it for the ladies. And if you think about it, the knight and the squire represent two sides of knighthood we saw way back in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The dad, the knight, is chivalry. He is chivalry incarnate. He is the embodiment of a chivalrous knight. The kid, the squire, is the embodiment of the courtly love, the romantic side of being a knight. So if you take the two of them together, the father and the son, they kind of represent both sides of knighthood. And you might get some pushback on this. Some people don't totally believe this, but you say the knight and the squire fall into the aristocracy category. There's some wiggle room there because maybe the knights weren't part of the aristocracy. Point being, they're as close as we come to aristocracy in this poem. Then you got the prioress, and a prioress is the head of a nunnery. She's a nun. So I'm going to tell you some things about her. You try to figure out if these don't exactly gel or jive with being a nun. First, she's obsessed with table manners, using the right spoon, the right fork, the right cup, and table manners. She speaks French, not Latin, and she's wearing a big honking piece of jewelry that says love conquers all. So let's take all that together. Obsessed with manners, speaks French, wearing jewelry. Sounds more like the aristocracy than the clergy, doesn't it? The fact that her necklace says love conquers all and the clergy aren't supposed to get married, have romantic relationships, that's another issue. The big takeaway is, and you're going to see this theme coming up again and again with the clergy, it seems like they're obsessed with living like the nobility, and that's one of Chaucer's problems with the church, that the church had way too much money, and at this time they were actually the largest landowners in all of Europe, so he sort of had a point there. But yeah, the prioress, the nun, table manners, French, jewelry, sounds kind of like she's living like the nobility rather than a clergy. Which brings me to our next pilgrim, the monk. The monk is big and fat and jolly. I mean, yes, I'm making him sound like Santa Claus, but my point is, he's the fact that he's big and fat, he's got plenty of food. Just like, well, give me a second on that. He's super, super into hunting, and hunting was the sport of the nobility back in the day. And he was so into it, he had a ton of fancy hunting clothes and about 9, I think, different hunting horses. And obviously, horses, not exactly, but horses were the cars back in the day. So they're basically saying the monk had like 9, they had like 9 different rides. Again, you could look at him as kind of like the male version of the prioress, where the prioress is living like the nobility in her way. The monk is living like the nobility in his way, in a more masculine way, going out hunting, eating a ton of food, having a bunch of different hunting horses. And our next pilgrim is part of the clergy, and he's being criticized in sort of a different way. This guy is the friar, and he was supposed to be hanging out. Well, if you're the clergy, you're supposed to be hanging out with the poor people, administering to the poor, attending to the poor. Instead, the friar hung out with the wealthy people, and his justification for that was, well, wealthy people could make bigger donations, which would make sense if he wasn't pocketing the donations. He was basically, if you committed some sin really, really bad, if you threw the friar some money under the table, he'd give you a penance, and you'd be good, and it would be okay. So he was corrupt AF. He was corrupt. And oh, by the way, he knew, and I put "knew" in quotes. You can figure out what I mean. Pretty much every barmaid and innkeeper in the area. So far we're seeing the clergy comes across as being either obsessed with being like the nobility or corrupt. And fast forward a little bit, this is not a huge character, but sometimes things don't change in 2,000 years. We have the merchant, and he's the first guy I think that falls into the everybody else category. He dresses well. He looks like he has a lot of money. He looks like he's on top of the world. He looks like he has all sorts of good stuff, and he does. Problem is, he's in debt up to his eyeballs. He owes so many people money. Like I said, some things don't change in whatever, 2,000 years, whatever, 600 years, whatever, since this poem was written. There are still people today who rack up a lot of credit, have a lot of stuff, but they're ending up being in debt. Another quick one, we have a student. Student is skinny, doesn't have any food. Student, even his horse is skinny, which is the equivalent of having like a beat up ride back in the day. So the kid is skinny, the student is skinny. The horse is skinny. Anyone want to take a guess why the student and his horse are skinny? Well, yes, it's because they don't have food, but it's because they don't have money. Why don't they have money? Because they spent all their money. He spent all his money on tuition and school books, and that doesn't happen today anymore at all. Ever does it? No, not at all. Not even a little bit. I'm going to skip over the next two. Here's something super interesting. We have the guildsmen. And if you play World of Warcraft or video games like that, a guild is, something you join to go on raids and stuff. This is where the origin comes from. Basically, guilds were the early equivalent of trade unions. And here you have a haberdasher, who's a hat maker, a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer, a couple of important. Basically, they're only identified as their professions. They don't actually get names. And they work collectively. This is what a guild does. Like I said, it's the early version of a trade union. And this is why you have an explosion of the middle class. And it has everything to do with the plague. Basically, if you got the plague, you were screwed. Like you were going to die. Like you were pretty much dead. The wealthy people got the heck out of population centers, went to the north where there weren't that many people, and rolled the plague out. Fun fact, that's actually what happened here in New York, where all the wealthy people from the city went out to the Hamptons to ride the plague out in some Mask of the Red Death kind of reality. Thing is, when the plague went away, and it didn't get cured, it just went away, all the wealthy people started coming back to the cities. Problem is, wealthy people still needed clothes weaved, hats made, saddles made, clothing dyed. Didn't know how to do that. You don't learn that in aristocracy school. before the plague, you had like 20 different, let's say hat makers, 20 different hat makers competing for business. After the plague wiped out something like 75% of the population, you only had 3 hat makers when you used to have 20. So what the hat makers did was banded together in trade unions and decided no matter what, we are not going to charge less than $20 a hat. They were able to jack up prices on the aristocracy, so they made more money. They had more disposable income, as we'll see next module that actually led to the Renaissance. But yeah, you actually had, oh, this is the beginnings of a wealthier middle class with disposable income. How good are the guild's members doing? Well, they have their own personal chef, so they're obviously doing pretty darn well. Just a couple other real quick pilgrims. We have a doctor, and when I say doctor, I don't mean doctor like actual medical doctor, sort of. Being a doctor wasn't considered a good and respectable profession up until like the late 1800s, early 1900s. When I'm talking about doctor here, he was more an astrologer than an actual doctor. Back in the day, the town or village doctor was also the town or village barber, because both of them got to use sharp instruments and cut things. Um, He's a doc. He's sort of a doctor, I guess. This guy made a ton of money during the plague, but that's really all we know about him. So, wife of Bath. I think I asked a interactive video question on this. The wife of Bath. Well, what do we know about her? Let's find out. She has been to Jerusalem 3 times, and that's a pretty far journey. She was married 5 times. She's very proud of her sexual prowess. She's not the typical woman of the Middle Ages. And a lot of people, one of the things when you study literature that you have to be careful of is reading modern ideas or theories or philosophies back into ancient works or older works. And a lot of people want to say that the wife of Bath is an early example of feminism in literature. She traveled further. I mean, most people didn't travel more than like 10, 15 miles from where they were born. She traveled all the way to Jerusalem 3 times. She was married 5 separate times. That's very, very atypical for a woman in the Middle Ages. People want to say she's an early example of feminism, but what you got to keep in mind, this work is satire. Chaucer isn't praising her. I don't want to say making fun of her, but he kind of is. He's almost saying this isn't what a woman is supposed to be like. This is almost the opposite of feminism. But Wife of Bath is actually one of the most famous and popular characters in this story. So it's worth pointing out, very atypical of a woman in this time period. So I've pointed out problems and issues with almost everybody. Now we are going to get 2 people who I can't find any problems with. One is a parson. And a parson is like a village priest, a local priest. He's not like anything higher up in the chain of command of the clergy. Here's what we know about him. Small town priest, does not use his money for profit like the friar, donated to the poor, he visited the sick to give them communion when they couldn't make it to church, and he thought priests should be examples of what people should live up to. Even in a poem, a story that has people being poked fun at and satirized left and right, I think the message is there are still good people. There are still people you can't complain about. And I think it's interesting that the best of the clergy is the lowest on the totem pole. And if there are good clergy, there are also good everybody else. And the parson has a brother. His name is the plowman. He's a hard worker. He's peaceful. He loves God. He gives to charity. So I think the message there is sort of clear that yes, there are good clergy, and there are also good everybody else. There are good people in that everybody else category. Next is not a good person in the, well, that's a little bit harsh. We have the miller. And the Miller, we're going to talk about what this is. The Miller is actually one of the first examples of something not great in literature, but let's get there first. The Miller he's a big and strong. He has a nasty mole growing on the side of his face with hair growing out of it. I went to a high school with a kid who had something that always reminds me of that. He's lecherous, which means he's very lustful and very into sex and tells bawdy jokes and nasty, dirty stories. Basically what a miller does is he turns grain into wheat, or he turns grain into flour. Here's the thing. If you gave him 50 pounds of wheat, you would get maybe 40 pounds of flour back. And it's not through the process. He would steal it from you. He's a crook. He stole. So he's coming across not very great. He's coming across, Chaucer's coming at him pretty hard morally, that he steals and he's lustful and lecherous, and bawdy, but also physically that, the big mole on his face. Here's the thing though. You get two little details about him. He has red hair and he plays the bagpipes. And that very much marks him as either Irish, maybe Scottish, maybe Welsh. And like I said, this is the first example of something not too great something terrible in Western literature: racism. Remember the original inhabitants of England, the Celts? Well, when all the invasions happened, the Celts got pushed to the fringes of Britain, all the way up to Scotland, to Wales, and all the way over to Ireland. And they were treated like crap by the other people in Britain. They were ostracized. They were very literally pushed to the fringes of the island. And they were treated terribly in reality. And here you see in literature, this guy is very much characterized. It's pretty terrible character is marked as being part of that Celtic fringe is what they call it. A couple other people, office manager, I don't need to talk about him. Then we get to maybe two of the worst people in the story, and they are both members of the clergy, which should answer the question, which of the classes comes across the worst. You have someone called the Summoner. He enforces church laws. He went from town to town to make sure church law was being followed. Here's what we know about him. He's straight up described as ugly and horny. There's no way to sugarcoat it. He eats nasty, disgusting, gross food. You find out that he barely knew Latin, and if he's a member of the clergy, he probably should know Latin. If you gave him a bottle of wine, he'd look the other way at any adultery that you committed, and he very, very obviously accepted bribes. And his partner, the person he travels with, is maybe even worse. So basically, the Summoner enforced church law, and the Pardoner pardoned you if you were found as being violating church law. Here's what you find out about the Pardoner. He's just back from Rome, which was like the capital city of Christendom, which gives you hope that, hey, maybe this guy isn't terrible, but you find out he was just there for the fashions, just there for the cutting-edge fashion. And what he did was he went from town to town selling fake relics. Basically, there was a big trade in like the bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, nails that were used in the crucifixion. All totally fraudulent. Like, you can't prove that that's what they were. But this guy swore up and down that, hey, I have bones of a saint, and if you give me money, I will sell them to you. And that is it's pretty much the last person we're going to talk about. So here's the upshot of Canterbury Tales. I think it comes across that the clergy comes across the worst out of all the three estates. And that, like I said, that was Chaucer's problem. He thought, like, the church had way too much money, and you see this coming across in two different ways. The members of the clergy who acted like the nobility, the prioress, and the monk, and the rampant corruption of people who were selling bribes, selling indulgences, selling fake relics. So clergy comes across the worst. Here's the other thing. We didn't talk about all of them, but we talked about a pretty diverse group of people. Millers and prioresses and pardoners and students and guildsmen and small town priests, a wide range of people cutting across all three estates or classes. Well, what brings them together? What unites them together? Well, it has to do with where they're going. They're going on a religious pilgrimage. It is religion that became the glue that held Europe together. And this is actually a pretty big point because before the Dark Ages, it was Rome, being part of the Roman Empire, that provided, for better or worse, some sense of unity. Once Rome fell, that sense of unity was kind of taken away. What replaced it was religion. What replaced it was Christianity. What replaced it is church unity. And that's the thing that held this diverse group of people together. So that's the upshot. That's the long and the short of Canterbury Tales. And that actually concludes our journey through the Dark Ages. Next time, we are going to talk about the Renaissance and how two really, really terrible things in human history led to the biggest explosion of creativity in the history of humanity.